Ladies and gentlemen, it's after Christmas. Welcome back to the podcast. I keep getting these people telling me more David Salomon, and here he is. We finally got him back here. Dr. David Salomon, happy holidays. I'm so thankful you're back, and I can't wait to get into this discussion today. How are you? Maybe for some people that may be joining us for the first time, could you introduce yourself?
Sure, and it's good to see you again, George. Happy
Thank you.
holidays. Stuck right here in between Christmas and New Year's, and everything else. So I am the director of undergraduate research and creative activity at Christopher Newport University, which is in Newport News, Virginia, near Virginia Beach. Been here for this is my sixth year. 3 decades as a professor of medieval and Renaissance literature, religion, and culture. Written a few books. My most recent one is on the seven deadly sins, and just trying to get through the holiday season. With
I
its with
do
it with
know.
its joys and its sadness. I think it's both, right?
Absolutely. It's that double-edged sword of
Yeah.
pleasure and pain, which brings us to a quote that I recently heard that I think can start us off is I think it was from Raj Patel who said, In today's world, we know the price of everything, but the value of nothing." What
Yeah.
is going on in this world of what things are worth? You've written an interesting blog which people can find in the show notes down below. But let's talk about your blog and these ideas that you were having. Maybe you could start us off.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a real distinction now between worth and value, and what does value mean? We tend to think in our contemporary Western world of value as being monetary and only monetary, and that we think of things worth being again in terms of the dollar, and that is not the way things always were, and it is probably not the best way for us to operate. I was thinking about this morning and thinking about the difference that we make between monetary value and sentimental value, right? And so we'll say, well, I'm holding on to this, book because it has sentimental value because it means something to me. It has no monetary worth. So someone outside looking at it objectively would say, well, why hold on to that? It's not worth anything. So I think there's a distinction here, and it's an important one to make because it really does increasingly affect the way that we perceive our own worth as human beings and the worth of others. And especially around this time of the year, it's really interesting. I had to run into my office this morning. We're closed this week, but I had to run in this morning to drop some things off and grab something from my office. And I was surprised there was a young woman working in the building. My office is in our library, and the library, of course, is closed. And it was a young woman working in the library. I actually had never seen her before, and so I struck up a conversation with her to see, how she was doing. I think she was the only person in the building. And I said, "You've got to work the whole week?" And she said, "Well, I'm part time. So part timers only get paid when they work, whereas full timers were given the week off for the holiday." And it struck me as I was talking to her, and I thanked her for working and for the hard work that she does, because there's a good example of the question of the worth of a person and the meaning of the money. It's just our world is just so bass backwards when it comes to looking at value in terms of money. Um, and I think that comes down to everything from the things that we own to the way that we look at jobs and salaries and think about the material objects that we get as a result of that.
Yeah, it seems to me, and I'm curious to get your opinion on this. We have so much technology today, and the way the world is going, it seems to me that somewhere along the line we have decided that we shouldn't mold a model based on what's best for humanity, but instead we've built a model that's based on profit. And when you do that, you irreversibly undermine the credibility of the leaders and the human experience.
Yeah. No, it's based on profit. It's based
Yeah.
on instant gratification, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, it reminds me, it's the scene in The Graduate where the future is plastic, right? I went into a Best Buy yesterday. I think I can say the name of the place, and they had a TV right there at the front of the store. They had them stacked up. There must have been a dozen of them still there. I think it was a 65-inch TV, and it was like $600.
Wow.
And that's just, if you think back to how much TVs cost, I mean, I think our first color TV probably cost $600, if not more. And it was one of those gigantic console TVs. And it just reminds me of the days when things broke, you got them fixed.
Yep.
And we don't do that anymore. We live in largely a disposable society. If something breaks, you get rid of it and you replace it, and that's because largely they don't cost as much as they once did. So we look at the things as disposable. I mean, I was talking to you before, George, before we went on the air. My MacBook this morning started acting all wonky, which is unusual, and I don't know what's going on, but then I looked it up and I realized, well, it is 4 years old, and I do use it a heck of a lot, and it's probably at the end of its life. And if you go back 30, 40 years and think about our parents and our grandparents, I mean, if you said that something at the end of 3 or 4 years was at the end of its life, they'd look at you like you were insane. What are you talking about? I mean, get it fixed. I saw a great meme on Facebook this morning that showed this hideous olive refrigerator from the 1970s that many of us remember, and those things will outlive us all, right? I mean, things were built to last, and I think that said something about the way that we valued them. We valued them we gave them greater value.
Mhm.
We were willing to spend a lot of money on an item because the assumption was, well, it's going to last. And that really doesn't happen anymore with anything. Clothes, right? I mean, you've got a young daughter. I mean, I've got a 19-year-old daughter. I mean, clothes doesn't last. And my daughter, who her and her friends love to shop at a discount. Well, it's not a discount, but it's a place. I won't say the name because I shouldn't say names on here. Huh? And I mean, they're notorious for having clothes that are dirt cheap, but they're made terribly. They're going to fall apart, and they know that buying them, and they're okay with that. You know, it
Yeah,
just strikes me as being an indication of the way that we think about worth. And I think that then sort of transcends then to the way that we look at people and the way that we look at each other and the value that we give
yes.
to each other.
Yeah, that was my next question. It seems to me that it's all connected. And so if we begin to live in this world of what Benjamin George is talking about, Apple's planned obsolescence is deliberate. When we began to look at that idea of planned obsolescence, and you had mentioned that it seems in the past there was a greater emphasis on craftsmanship and
Yeah.
pride in work, and that has to affect our psyche. That has to affect the way we look at ourselves. When you buy something and it fails in 2 years, that has a psychological effect on you. And if you're surrounded, if you are in fact a extension of everything that surrounds you and everything is planned obsolescence, maybe that's why we're seeing this surge in sort of euthanasia. That's why we're seeing this. I've heard more sirens this year during Christmas than I ever have in
Mhm.
my life, and it makes me sad.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, those things got to be connected, and it's this idea of worth. Like, we are worth so much more.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. I mean, and we are seeing kind of a renaissance in craftsmanship
Yeah.
and an interest in vintage and
Mm-hmm.
antique items. And I think that largely speaks to this question as far as when we're talking about things, at least, right?
Yeah.
Um, that we do value craftsmanship.
Yep.
But the problem is that it was interesting. We when we were traveling over the holidays, we were up in We were in Massachusetts visiting my mother-in-law, and I don't remember why, but there's a Walmart down the street from where she lives, and so we went down there to pick up something. I can't even remember what we went in there. Oh, my daughter wanted peanut butter, and we don't shop in Walmart as a rule, for a variety of reasons. And it's just incredible because the prices are so low. You can see why people do.
Yeah.
And I think, that's the thing here. It's you walk into a store where items are priced high because they're made well, and we've made that a class thing. I can remember when I was in high school, I was dating this girl who I took to prom, and her birthday was coming up, so I wanted to go to her birthday present. So my best friend at the time and I, we went to the mall, and we went to this jewelry store, and I'll never forget this. We walked into the jewelry store, and as soon as we walked in, I realized that this was way out of my price range. It was carpeted, and there were places to sit in front of the display cases, and I thought, "Oh no, I'm really screwed here." But I was already in the store, so you got to save face, right?
Right.
So I walked forward, and the salesperson came forward to greet me, and I think I stumbled on a buckle in the carpet and nearly
Mhm.
face planted on the floor. And we just hightailed it out of there because it was. But we've turned it into a class issue, and that I think is really dangerous.
Mm.
It's dangerous because it pigeonholes people. Um, I think back to we bring them up often, Shakespeare. And when I teach Shakespeare and we talk about, whether or not these characters are have any kind of mobility when it comes to society,
Yeah.
or are you just born into what you're born into and that's it? Um, and I think that part of the so-called American dream, which many argue is dead, is that you aren't born into a spot that you are stuck in, that you can move about in society, in class. And I think it's indicated by more than just salary. I think it's indicated by our spirituality. It's indicated by what we value in others. And that's a tremendous part of the reflecting that so many of us are doing this last week of the year, right? I mean, it's this time for reflection as the new year
Yeah.
comes, and you start to think about what you're grateful for and what you're thankful for, and how, and it's most often it's about the way that you value friends and family, and colleagues and people who, like that young woman working in the library this morning, who I don't even know her. But I value her for what she's doing, and I respect her for it, and I want to show her that I appreciate that. Um, a few weeks ago, before we closed down for the holidays on campus, I threw a holiday party in my office. We did it before COVID, but we haven't done it since. Of course, we couldn't in the time in between, and it was I cater it from outside, and we pretty much open it up as an open house. But I make sure that I personally invite the housekeeping staff.
Yeah.
And when they showed up, I mean, a couple of people even mentioned, that they look like the happiest people in the world. That they were getting Olive Garden. Um, and if I can do that, then to show them how I value them, that's great. But it isn't just that one time in the year, right? I'm always baffled at how people treat others who are doing menial work, and ignore them, or look down on them. And I don't know which one is worse. I think
Mm.
ignoring them is actually worse. And I remember a couple of years ago, I think it was when I first got here, I was talking to somebody on campus who worked in the physical plant, was either a housekeeper or one of the guys who work on campus. And I was having a conversation with him, and later on, a colleague of mine said that she noticed it, and she said the guy looked stunned. And I said, I don't know why. And she said, because probably nobody really ever talks to him. I mean, they don't talk to professors. Professors don't talk to them. There is in our culture such a hierarchy,
Yeah.
which I think is such a dangerous and nasty thing. I mean, my daughter complains that I'll talk to anyone. I mean, I had a half-hour conversation with the guy who calls for the cabs at the hotel when I was in Washington D.C. over the summer. I found out all about him. What an interesting life the guy's had.
Yeah.
Um, it's important to do that, to show that we value each other.
Yeah, that seems like the fabric of society that keeps us together. And I think there's a lot to be said about social mobility in a healthy society. When there is no social mobility, then I think you start running into the despairs that or the cancers that can cause the deterioration of society. You run into
Yeah.
these things called hate and dishonesty and distrust, and there's no self-care in that particular relationship and no self-respect. It's difficult to respect yourself when you don't respect others around you. And like you said, you spoke with a guy that you may not have had a whole lot in common, but when you start talking about cabs, you realize I don't know anything about cabs. This guy's an expert. This guy's got a lot of information that I could probably learn from.
He had told me he'd worked for that hotel for something like 30 years. He'd worked his way up. He's done just about everything there could be in there. And now he was the doorman who stands out in front. And we were talking about the people he meets, and it was intriguing. I think it's really important to get that insight into what makes people tick, and what gets them to where they are, how they got to where they are. I mean, he said he was very happy with what he did. He was
Yeah.
very happy. Whereas other people might look and say, "Oh, what a cruddy job." Stand out there all day calling cabs for people. He said he loved it. And so I gained an appreciation for what he did by talking to him, and then further gained an appreciation for him, as another human being, and not thinking about him as the doorman, right? And I think about the closing. There's a closing scene, and there's a novel by Saul Bellow called "Seize the Day." I don't know if you know it. It was Bellow's first book. Bellow, the great Chicago novelist, Nobel Prize winner, and "Seize the Day," his first novel, published, I think, in the late '50s, early '60s. It's about a guy who is basically down on his luck, and is trying to get help from his very wealthy father, who refuses to give it to him. And at the end of the novel, Tommy Wilhelm, this character, has been taken in by a scam artist, and he's running through the city looking to try to find him, because the guy has disappeared with his money, what was left of his money. He stumbles into a funeral, and he gets into the funeral line, and as he gets to the front of the line, he starts weeping. And the people who are sitting there at the funeral think, "Oh, that must be somebody, very close to the deceased," and the interior monologue that Bella gives you is that what Tommy was really thinking is that there's another human being. It's just that simple. It's that we consider each other as human beings. I mean, it sounds cliche, but on one level, we're all equal, right?
Yeah.
There's not much that makes us different. And when it comes to looking at worth, I mean, we've talked about that. I told you that story about my trip to San Francisco when I was in graduate school, and meeting that homeless gentleman on the street, and kneeling down to give him some money, looking him right in the eye and saying, you take care of yourself. And he just looked stunned. That afternoon that I had that day was just life changing for me because it just showed me how we're all the same. We're all just trying to make it, right? Whether I'm, standing there with my new briefcase and my trench coat and trying to get a job as a professor, or the guy who's in the jumpsuit cleaning out the ashtrays at the elevator. We're all trying to do the same thing. And I think that that speaks to how considerate we are of each other. There's been so much talk during and since COVID about showing grace for people, right? Give people
Mm.
grace, give them a little bit of space,
Yeah.
right? And I think we should always be doing that. We're all struggling.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me to think about, I had some notes that I was thinking about, and it just turned out that I had one written on grace, and I forgot exactly what I did with it. But there seems to be, and maybe you can speak to this because I think it's relevant. There's two ideas I think in theology about grace. One is immanence and one is eminence. And one is that grace comes from God to us, and then one is that emanates from inside us. Are you familiar with those two things? Maybe you could flesh those
Yeah,
out for us.
yeah, more or less. I mean, it's again, it's that distinction between how we view the
Yeah.
deity,
Yeah.
right? I mean, is it external to us, and are we waiting for presence, basically, both in the sense of presence with a TS and presence with a CE at the end? Um, are we waiting for that, or do we make that ourselves? Now, of course, in Catholic theology, I mean, the idea is that only God grants grace, right? I mean, you can't do it. But I think that as we have moved to a more, I don't know if it's even secular or if it's ecumenical
Mm,
society, I think we've gotten a little bit beyond that notion with the idea that, yeah, we really do need to show grace, and we can,
yeah.
and that if we operate under the notion that it will only be given to us from above, it's going to create a lot of division and a lot, and as you mentioned before, a lot of hatred,
Hmm.
and a lot of lack of compassion for each other. I mean, the only reason that I have compassion for someone is because I can show them some grace. I understand what you're going through. Here, have some space. Do you need to talk? And that has become so important. During COVID, it was interesting because so many of us, myself included, were really despairing and wondering, how are we ever going to get out of this? And I went back and I was reading about, well, I wanted to read about how the country came out of the 1918 pandemic,
Right.
which was so horrific. And so how did we get out of that? And I went back and started reading some of the books that were written about that pandemic at the time, and there wasn't much mention about the recovery. And I talked to a historian friend of mine, and I said, I'm looking for something that really looks at how did the country come out of that? And he said, World War One.
Hmm.
And it never even clicked that that's what was going on. And so, it's interesting because here we are now, what, 3 years into this. I mean, it'll be, let's see, it was March of 20, right? So yeah, it's almost 3 years since the outbreak of COVID, and it hasn't gone away. We knew it wouldn't, and I'm still not sure that we've recovered, quote unquote, whatever the hell that means. Certainly, the economy hasn't recovered.
Yeah.
I don't know if society as a whole has recovered. I mean, I just did some traveling throughout the Northeast and saw a lot of people still wearing masks.
Yeah.
To my surprise, there were a couple of places where I went in New York City where they actually required masks still,
Mm.
or had brought them back. I don't know if they had let them go. Um, and so I'm still questioning. How do we get out of this? How do we recover? What does recovery look like? I don't know. I don't know what it will look like, but I don't think we're there yet. But a lot of that comes from, again, the increased feeling that we have for each other. I mean, the value that I place on our friendship, George,
Yeah.
is very important to me. Um, for and I was just going to use a throwaway and say, for what it's worth. I mean, it's not worth anything, right? I mean, it's not worth any monetary value, um, but it has a value that's really beyond that.
Yeah, in some ways, thank you. In some ways, I think that maybe the way out of this is redefining or remembering what is worthwhile. You know,
Yeah,
I'm always reminded of this. Sometimes I'm reminded of this quote, and I cannot. I always forget the exact book and the numbers, but it's something along the lines of, I was born with a thorn in my side, a messenger from Satan to torment me. I prayed to the Lord to take the thorn away from me. And in his infinite wisdom, I heard a voice call to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for in weakness my power is made perfect. And I think that this talk about grace, this idea of what's really worthwhile, is seeing yourself in the other person. And I think
yeah,
that maybe what we're doing on some level, talking to a few people here, or admiring the relationships we have, or taking time to talk to someone you haven't met before, and not only talking to them, but communicating with them and
yeah,
giving them your sincere ideas of, hey, thank you for doing this. I'm stoked you're here. It's a pleasure to see you. And like, that goes a long way. That
yeah.
stretches further than any buck will ever go. And I think by some of the things you said, maybe our objective should be to realign society along the laws of grace and just carry ourselves with a little bit more humility and understand that, hey, maybe grace is the shield for materialism, but I like what you're saying, and I think that it does redefine worth. Like, who are we to let the material world define worth for us? Maybe we should be stronger than that. Maybe we should define what worth is.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I think the problem is we're swimming upstream when it
Yeah.
comes to that, right? We're swimming against a current of capitalism and greed and materialism that makes it very difficult. As we were chatting earlier about the fact that the holiday season now has transformed from being Thanksgiving to Christmas, 4 weeks maybe, when stores were very busy selling a lot of what they sold. That was the way they made their money really for the year in those four
Yeah.
weeks. That's not really the case anymore because now it's, with the internet, it's 24/7. And we've got, Cyber Monday and this Tuesday and that Wednesday. I mean, we've come up with names for all these crazy things in order to just make more money. I mean, we were watching the news a couple of hours ago, and all the problems that the airlines are having in the last couple
Mm,
of days, particularly Southwest.
yeah.
And the fact of the matter is, these are corporations that make billions of dollars, and the people who run them make billions of
Yep.
dollars. And so, when they get on and complain about how, well, we can't do this because we don't have the resources, it's just like, you make $10 billion a year, you individually. I mean, there's just something out of whack about it. Something just completely out of whack about it. I mean, we all want to be paid what we're worth.
Right.
Now, what the hell does that mean? I don't know. I mean, it's based on, I suppose it's based on our experience, it's based on our education, it's based on our
Hmm.
knowledge, it's based on our skill set. I mean, all of those things. Um, but it just doesn't seem to work out that way, though, does it? Um, and there are a lot of people who are making a lot more money, and it's kind of out of whack with what their
Yeah.
skill set is. right? I mean, the big complaint about professional sports. I mean, it's insane, the salaries that they're making. It's insane. And people say, "Oh, well, they're only going to work for a couple of years." Yeah, okay. So you spread out what they're getting paid. I mean, Aaron Judge just re-signed with the Yankees, and I forget what the contract was, but it was some obscene number. And I posted on Facebook the story, and I said it's just under what I make as a professor. I mean, it's just, how do we value these things? How do we set a value on them? I don't know what the answer to that is. Um, and things have changed so dramatically in the last 30, 40, 50 years when it comes to this. I mean, I grew up upper middle class in the Bronx. My father was self-employed. He had a business. He was a salesman. My mother didn't work growing up. When I was growing up, she raised the kids. I had two siblings, a younger brother and a younger sister. I don't know how the hell we lived the way that we did. I really don't. My father didn't make a lot of money. He was comfortable. I think he would have said he was comfortable. And we were always comfortable. We never wanted for anything. But you look at it now, and I look back on that. I mean, I have one daughter. I don't know how the hell he did it. Having three kids, I couldn't afford that today.
Yeah, and I think that there's some other interesting, maybe it's the evolution of our idea of money, and it seems that with
Mm,
this increased materialism comes increased fear, and with increased fear comes broken relationships, and with broken relationships comes the inability to fully actualize who you are, and it just seems like this cycle is coming. But I choose to think that it's always dark before the light. And while I see some storm clouds gathering, maybe this is exactly what we need to redefine it. I really think that the thing you see happening around the world, whether it's a war going on in the Ukraine, whether it's SBF and this destruction of crypto and billions of dollars, or whether it's the commercialization of Christmas and the stripping of spirituality from the lives around us, it seems to me that it's crumbling in on itself, and just like a phoenix, we're going to see something come out of it. And I know I said this a second ago, but I really think that the foundation is built from the everyday people, from Stacy and Ben that are listening to us, and Nick listening to us, to you and I, to the relationships that we build on an everyday. We may never live to fully actualize and see what comes of the
yeah,
relationship or the time you spoke with the homeless guy down there, and the random acts of
yeah,
kindness that you do for people. But I honestly think that those are the cornerstones of building a life worth living. And I think we're doing it down here. And it's hard because you don't see it. You may never see it.
yeah.
But the fact that you know it allows you to have the courage to move forward, to continue to do it.
I think you're
I'm proud
you're
of you.
absolutely right. You're absolutely right, and I think that really speaks to it. I mean, the fact of the matter is, we may not see it, we may not know it, right?
Yes.
But again, we live in a world of instant gratification. We
Yeah.
want it immediately, but we may not see the result. I
Yeah.
mean, it's what I deal with in higher ed. I'm talking about the value of a liberal arts education. Excuse me. Value of the liberal arts education is not an immediate payoff. And so when they do these moronic market analyses about, majors and how much they're being paid, it's like, well, yeah, the computer engineers are making a buttload of money right away. Of course they are. They have skills that they're learning immediately that are applicable to the real world and what they're doing. Liberal arts education takes a lot longer to sink in because we're talking about thoughts and ideas
Yeah.
that you really need to ruminate on. And so I've always said, if you really want to gauge the value of a liberal arts education, talk to people 10, 20 years after they graduate and see how they reflect then. Luckily, I mean, for Facebook, I'm able to keep in touch with students from literally decades ago, and to be able to hear from them about and see the value of what they learned and how it's finally paying off. But it may take quite a long time. And I think that's the case with things too, to some degree. I mean, I'm sitting here in my study, And I'm going to go off screen for a second and grab
Sure.
something. I have always kept this. This is a cane that was my grandfather's. I used to have a top hat that went with it. That was his. The top hat, unfortunately, got destroyed. But this cane, I mean, I don't think it has any monetary value, but it has a lot of value to me
Sure.
because it was his. I mean, he died in 1970, and I haven't found a picture um, with him using it. I'm sure that there probably are some somewhere. I probably have some somewhere, but there's value to this to me. And I think if we think about long-term value of not just things, but of ideas and
Yeah.
thoughts and what we learn and how we feel, that we'd do better off than we do looking at, well, what's the immediate payoff?
Hmm.
What am I seeing from this? Because life doesn't work that way. It just doesn't. And I think that the things that are the greatest value to us are the things that endure, and oftentimes that we don't realize for a long time afterwards. Um, and whether that's relationships or experiences, I mean, we could talk about experiences and the value of experiences, right? And the fact of the matter is that in most cases, you don't realize immediately the value of an experience. It takes a while to reflect on that and realize that, yeah, that was really important.
Yeah, if it's as we're thinking about value and grandparents and reflection, especially this time of year, we can take a look at some of the greatest literature that was ever written, and it's obtuse in a way that, you know, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It seems that in times of calamity, we often look back at literature and you hear these people talk, it was the best time of my life, even though the bombs were raining down. There was a sense of
Yeah,
community like I've never. It's almost like when there's these tragedies and calamities in our lives, everything is stripped away except what matters. And we are
yeah.
shown this is what matters. And it's sad that it has to get to that point, and it may have to get to that point now, but maybe we could take a clue from that. And I'm sure you could think of some great literature of every war where people were talking about that,
Well,
right?
I'm just thinking. I mean, resurgence in the reading of the Diary of Anne Frank over the last couple of years has
Yeah.
been really interesting.
Right.
And a lot of Holocaust literature for that matter. But yes,
Sure.
looking back on literature that was written during times of incredible hardship. I mean, one of my favorite George Orwell novels is his autobiographical novel called Down and Out in Paris and London.
Mm.
And it's miserable. I mean, it's a miserable experience that this character has, living in Paris and London, basically living underground, for lack of another way of putting it. But it's a brilliant novel because what you see from those experiences is then, as you mentioned earlier, the phoenix, right? The
Yeah.
triumph. How do you get out of it? How do you get out of it? There's a great little video that people can look up on YouTube where Kurt Vonnegut explained the shape of a story years ago. It's absolutely hilarious, but he's absolutely right. He talks about the fact that we can graph stories. He's got a chalkboard. We can graph stories like you do a math problem, and he says the greatest stories are the stories where somebody starts out at a certain
Yep.
point and things go really downhill, and then they come back out of it. We love those stories, he says. We want to see how people do that, how they
Yeah.
get out of it. And I think part of it is because we see ourselves there, and part of it is that it's strategizing,
Yeah.
right? I mean, when you're at your lowest point, how do you get out of it? I think about the book by Chodron called "Things Fall When Things Fall Apart," the Buddhist book, which is really a wonderful little book on being just in a horrific place and how you get out of it, how do you survive? It's a wonderful little book that I highly recommend. When Things Fall Apart.
Yeah, I think you know, comedy comes from these same places. Like some of the best comedy is
Yeah,
these people that are sitting around their dinner table with nothing to eat, or like just sharing up a small portion, and you have the family of them, and someone says something and everyone starts laughing. But it's
yeah,
almost like everything must be stripped away for you to see things clear. And we're so the idea of the material has clouded our judgment, has clouded our tables, and has clouded our thought process for so long. It's almost like we live in a world of decadence and we're so unhappy about it. It's kind
yeah,
of crazy to think about.
yeah. Well, I think you're right, though. I mean, some of it is stripping it away and sort of
Right?
and almost seeing the absurdity of it, right?
Yeah.
Um, I'll tell you a funny story. I must have been about maybe 15. We were having a Passover Seder, which we used to do every year, and everyone in the family would sit around the table and would read the Haggadah, which is the story of Passover, and everybody has their own sort of role. So the youngest reads the four questions. There are different sections of it. There was a spot where my brother had to read a passage, and he misread it. It was something about saving our good future, and instead he read it as saving our good furniture. We were all on the floor laughing, and it was a moment that just took away, it stripped away the pompousness of this the ceremony of it, and just showed, look how silly this is, right? And it was funny because for years after that, whenever we came to that passage, we would all just break out laughing because we remembered when he misread it that year. But I think that you're right. I mean, some of the greatest comedy, of course. I mean, look at slapstick comedy in the 1930s,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Which came out of the Depression. I mean, it was people wanting to see silly stuff, and laugh. And there was a special on, I think it was on last night on PBS. I haven't seen it yet, on Dick Cavett and Groucho Marx.
Mm.
I'm a big Marx Brothers fan, so I want to see it. And I mean, look at the Marx Brothers comedies.
Yep.
It's the same kind of thing. It's about stripping away the kind of the it's stripping away the decadence in many ways,
Yeah, it is.
right? I mean, the characters in most of those films are down on their luck kind of guys, and working menial jobs, and poking fun at the decadence. The Chaplin films, some of the Chaplin films do the same thing.
Yeah.
City
Yep.
Lights does the
Yep.
same thing. I mean, he the in that film, the rich guy thinks that, Charlie has saved his life and is wealthy, and he takes him on, and it's all ludicrous. But I mean, it in many ways, it's that kind of looking at the world as being just absurd, right? Which is a in some ways a very existentialist approach to things. I'm thinking about, of course, Samuel Beckett, Waiting for Godot, and absurdist theater, right? Where I mean, the point is to show you that life is kind of absurd. I mean, that play, if folks don't know it, Waiting for Godot, right? A two-act play in which two characters, Vladimir and Estragon, wait for a guy named Godot. They've never met him before. They don't know what he looks like. They wait for him. The play ends. He never comes. And when it was premiered in New York City, I had a graduate professor who was actually at the premiere, and he said people got up at the end of the first act and said, "What the hell is this?" Because nothing happened. Nothing happened, and in many ways, that's what our existence is, right? I mean, most of the time that we spend alive, nothing happens. I mean, you're waiting for the bus, right?
Yeah, I would say the majority of our life is in process to something, and,
Yes,
and we're so caught up in this idea of reaching the mountaintop, or
yes,
cashing the $1 million check, or finishing this or finishing that. But the truth is you're in process. Even if
yeah,
you hit that milestone, hey, you made it. Now get back in line. you know?
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And to focus more on the journey.
Yeah.
The journey is more important.
Yeah,
The
and
journey is
that
more important.
yeah. It seems, I think that somehow worth and meaning are connected. And the beauty of that is that in life, you can't choose what happens to you, but you and you alone get to choose the meaning of that event. And I think
Right.
if you learn to ascribe or give meaning to things in your life, it will be more meaningful. And it can be something small. It can be the moment you have breakfast with your daughter. It can be making a cup of coffee for your wife in the morning and putting a little whipped cream leaf on there or something. You know what I mean? And just and like that helps with the process. Like
Yeah.
now you have something to look forward to. You have someone to love and you got something to do. And it's maybe that is like the beauty of life, is that at any point in time we can choose to live a life worth living. I think it's there
Yeah.
for us. And it's
Yeah.
conversations like this that help me bring it out. Like if I'm in a funk or, I'm caught up in work, like it's so refreshing to talk to some people. Man, that's another thing. Like you and I are having an amazing conversation. It makes my life better and I look forward to it. And I hope other people do, but it's right there for us. We can
Yeah.
have these meaningful moments.
But in order to understand that these things have meaning, we need to take a moment and pause and reflect on it. But
Yeah.
modern life is so fast, we're moving on to the next thing, and don't get the chance, many people don't, to stop and reflect and say, "Oh, wow, that was really amazing."
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, I think it's numbed our senses,
Yeah.
and so we're expecting things to be even more incredible, right? Because
Yeah.
it's got to overwhelm us, and then we're disappointed when they don't. It's a Buddhist idea, right? I mean, life is suffering, right?
Yeah.
But there is a way out of it, right? And part of the way out of it is on reflecting and contemplating what has occurred to you and making meaning out of it, right? I mean, things have meaning that we oftentimes, brush under the rug.
Yeah.
It's like, well, wait a minute, that was meaningful, and so think about that. What does it mean? Because really, everything that occurs to us has to have some kind of meaning. Unless you're in Waiting for Godot and he never shows up. Um, I mean, I believe there is meaning to things. I don't believe that in that absurdist approach, but I think we need to really pause to think about it, and discussions like the ones that we have, and folks tuning in, are certainly interested in, I think, doing that, and slowing down and thinking about, well, what does that mean? What's the value of that experience? What was the value of that experience? Right? Thinking back on it. And we do that through our whole lives. It's just some of us are a little bit more, um, I don't know, tapped into it, and interested in it, and interested in not living a superficial existence. Does that sound too highfalutin?
No, I would agree. I think that in today's world of technology and marketing and profit and you know not a whole lot of reflection. We have a Johnson here. Thank you for making some comments. Nick, everybody, thank you for making some comments on here. Johnson brings up this idea about government, and it seems to me like when I look at what's put on the airwaves, it almost seems like, pick your poison, but it just seems like there's all these hate merchants that are trying to get us to not reflect on who we are and what life can be. But I do honestly think that there is a brand new marketplace, and that's marketplaces for our attention. And it goes back to what you said about us not having the time to reflect. There is this, when you look at some of the new technology and they're monitoring your eye movements, or you're looking at the metaverse, or people get paid by likes and followers. There is so much emphasis on, on acquiring this new real estate that is attention. And when there's a market for attention, there's all these people competing for it. And
Oh,
it
sure.
just, right? It seems odd to me.
Well, that's what Google is all about, right?
Yes.
It's about getting eyes on things, right? I mean, that's what so much of this is. I mean, it's an off track, off tangent point, but something that we
Right.
should probably think about,
Sure.
talk about in the future is, the growing and in recent days, the frightening news about artificial intelligence,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, and the ways that now there's these new AI systems that just are they're kind of frightening in how close they are to Alan Turing's
The Turing
idea.
test. Yeah.
But I laugh at that because so we're getting good at artificial intelligence, and we haven't even gotten that good with human intelligence. We should work on that first.
That's so
Um,
true.
and so I think it's kind of ironic. So we're going to have artificial intelligence will actually be, pretty good, and human intelligence still, we got a lot of work to do.
Right. It's so hubristic to think that we can create something better than than what we have. Like, we're not even
Yeah.
trying to make ourselves better. What gives us the idea that we can make something artificially better than when we're not
Yeah.
even trying to make ourselves better? It seems
Well,
funny
and
to me.
and of course, the initial idea behind it is that, well, so it will be able to take care of all these menial tasks and do these kinds of things that, it'll free us up to do what?
Right. Right.
What are we doing?
Yeah,
So we
it's
can, we can watch more Netflix. I mean, what are we doing? I don't see that people are taking advantage of the freedom that technology is giving them to actually advance the species.
right. That's a great point. Like, it seems that we've gotten away from shared sacrifice and shared goals, and
Mm,
now it's just who has the most. And when you get there, you undermine the foundation. Like, it's you've taken away the idea that we all share things together, that we're all part of this. You've taken away this idea that you don't come into this place, you come out of it. And when you come out of it, everybody's working together to create a better life for our children. Maybe my kid doesn't have the same life that someone else's kid have, but we can have the same goals. We can have the same sacrifices. And if I see somebody else do it, maybe I learn how they do it, or maybe they learn from me. And when we stratify the way when we set up this pyramidal structure where, okay, this person up here has the most, they're better. Wait a minute. Like,
yeah.
we get back to worth. Like, that's not true. And so I bet you there's a lot of people, I have fell into this before, where, it's almost like when you see somebody who's really wealthy, you assume that they've earned that. You assume that they've done something great to get it, but that's not always the case.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. And I think that the value of collaboration,
Yes.
um, is often lost, right? I mean,
Yep.
so working together, we can make significant advances and changes. Benjamin mentions, the AI was the same promise of the computer. It really was, right? I mean, we've mentioned it before. I mean, that fantastic essay by Vannevar Bush, As We May Think, written in 1945, where, I mean, he basically predicts the internet.
Right.
The whole idea was, well, it's going to free us up to do the higher level thinking that human beings really should be doing. It's like, well, how's that working out for you? Because I don't see a lot of that going on. And so, it's looking at meaning and value, and as Stacy says, we put too much focus and meaning onto goal-based achievements. She
Yes.
certainly, we everything is, we're striving for a goal, we're striving for an end, and again, it's going back to this. It's important to instead really focus on the process and the journey. It makes me think about video games, right? Which I do not play, but
Right.
I remember playing them in the arcades in the 1980s. But They're all goal based, aren't they? I mean, it's all, you're looking to achieve something or unlock something to bring you to a next level.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just we seem to have confused what really is important.
Yeah, I think we've lost our way in some ways. And I really think that this unraveling that we're seeing, I think I'm hopeful that we can come to a state of clarity before the unraveling completely happens. Because I think that there are things we can do. When we talk about this older idea you know, um, of computers freeing us up to have more time, like there's plenty of things like, why don't we tax the computers? All these corporations that have machines, why don't those machines pay income tax? Why don't the employees that used to work there now make the same amount of money from those machines instead of that money
Hmm.
being kicked upstairs? Like that money
Yeah,
could go in to all kinds of infrastructure. Like there are things we could do if we weren't based in a society in which profit was the only motive.
yeah,
And I realize that some people look at that as, oh, well, that's being socialism or that's being this. Like, we don't need those terms. Like, it doesn't have to be that. It could be
right.
something where we could reinvent ourselves to a point where, I think it's Bhutan that has a gross national happiness. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like, there's no shame in having at least an idea about that. Like, we could measure our wealth by how few homeless people there are. We could do a lot of things that we're not doing because a few people want to continue to go down the path we've been going down, even though it's destructive.
yeah. I mean, the profit driven society, I just think has really, it has not done us well,
Right.
as a society. Certainly, it's done some people very well,
Sure.
but it has not done us well as a society. And when I walk into a store and they have replaced the cashiers and the cash registers with the self checkout things,
I
right? I
don't
mean,
like that.
which is such a controversy.
Right.
Um, people joke about the fact that, well, they should be paying me now because I'm doing their job, right? I
Yeah.
mean, I'm checking myself out, so I should be paid the job of the cashier. But I mean, the big fear is, well, what happened to all those people? What are they
Yep.
doing?
Yep.
And you can say, well, they're freed up because they're doing other jobs. Like, but the reality is they're not.
Yeah.
The reality is most of them probably laid off,
Yep.
and they lose their jobs. And it's just it's all in the name of profit and
Yeah.
the dollar, right? I mean, I think it was Benjamin mentioned, the age of the endless dopamine hit, right? I mean, that's
Yeah,
it.
that's
I
true.
like that because that's really what it is. I mean, we look for that regardless of what we're doing. We get that dopamine hit, whether that's from achieving, unlocking a goal in a video game, or getting more likes on Instagram, or all this other nonsense, which just doesn't have any real value. It doesn't really have any real value. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter. At the end of
Yeah.
the day, it doesn't matter. All that matters is I've got to look at myself in the mirror at the end of the day. I've got to live with myself and care about the people around me. It's one of the messages that I repeat in the book on the seven deadly sins, is this care for, how we're caring for each other as human beings and caring for each other as just members of humanity. And we're losing our humanity. I mean, it's that D.H. Lawrence line
Yeah.
from his essay. We've lost our sun, right? We've lost our center.
Yeah. It's it's a fascinating time we live in. And I heard a good analogy a while back that I hadn't heard before. I really like to talk about the idea of, just like a silkworm spins its web and gets caught in it, so too do we as a society, as individuals, and as a planet. We spin our own cocoon and we get caught up in this idea of, we just spin this web around us and then we live in this cocoon of, this is what this is, this is what this is. And, but just like a cocoon, there's a metamorphosis that happens. And I like to think that's kind of what's happening to us as a society, and this destruction that we see, this end of empire, this idea of materialism, and this idea of this, you know, all of them, the socialism, the materialism, the homelessness, all these problems that are happening, I think are going to be the detritus of this cocoon. And we're going to break through. Like, education seems to be a spot where we're beginning to see the world change, and we're beginning to see the way children are taught are potentially going to be the ones that pave a new way for us. But I heard another analogy that's this idea of a snake. The way a snake sheds its skin is it finds a really rough patch of grass or a rough patch of dirt or something. And then it goes out to that piece of dirt and it starts at its mouth, and then it has to wiggle around on this really rough piece of a rough patch so it can get that skin off of it. And it's really vulnerable at that time. The same way a birth is vulnerable, the same way that a cocoon is vulnerable, so is the snake shedding its skin. And I really believe that that is us right now. We are in the cocoon. We are the snake shedding its skin. And I think we're not done yet. Like, there's a lot of trauma that's probably coming. But if you can understand that we are in a metamorphosis, then you can begin to look for the corrosive part of the cocoon to break out of. Then you can look for other people that may need help getting the skin off of them. And I think that is maybe something that's for us to do, is to look around and find someone that may be a little bit vulnerable and help them. And that's so rewarding. And I think it'll make your life better.
No, I agree, but think about how incredibly brave it is for that snake to be willing to be that vulnerable,
Yeah.
right? I mean, granted, you could say, well, it's the snake's nature, okay, but I mean, there is something about that. I mean, being vulnerable is scary as hell,
Yes. You could die.
and you really do have to have some kind of bravery about it to know that you're going to come through on the other end and be okay. And that's where, as you mentioned, being there for each other when we're going through this vulnerability is really important, and understanding that vulnerability and appreciating it, and valuing the vulnerability, right?
Beautiful.
I value that you're willing to be able to be vulnerable, right? To transform into something else.
Yeah, I think that kind of takes us back to this idea of worth. Like, it's worth it to be vulnerable because you have to change, you have to grow. And the only way to do that is to become vulnerable. Otherwise, you'll never grow into that which you need to grow in to be successful or happy or nurture someone around you. And it's worth being vulnerable, right? It's worth it.
Yeah. No, well said. Well said. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, and I think if we look at that metaphor of the larva and the cocoon, and going through those
Yeah.
stages, it might be something that's really instructive for us to think about as a species. That maybe that's what we're going through at the moment.
Yeah. David, I love talking to you, and I'm so glad that we've had a few moments to do this. I've been looking forward to this, and as we're getting ready to land the plane here, would you be so kind as to tell people what you got coming up, where they
Yep.
can find you, and what you're excited about?
Sure. So coming up, I'm working on new blog posts, and working on two new book projects,
Oh,
and really trying to figure out how I can get them out. Publishing has changed a lot in the last few years, and one is on Angels and Demons, a book that I'm writing with my wife on angels and demons in pop culture, which I hope will be out in 2024. I think we're going to finish it next year. And then I'm also starting to work on a collection just of essays, some of the things that are in the blog, and some other pieces as well, and looking to see where I might be able to get that out. Looking forward to the spring semester, new year. We start classes in a couple of weeks here, and I'm teaching my advanced museum studies course, so my students will be curating an exhibit. So I think that's going to be really fun, and looking forward to another trip to the UK in June. I'll be in London in May and into June for a study abroad trip with students to go to museums in London, and excited about that trip as well.
That sounds like a whole lot of fun, and it sounds like it sounds worthwhile, and it sounds like a life worth living. So I'm excited for that, and I hope everybody checks out David's books. I hope you go to his blog, reach out to him. He's an amazing man who cares a lot about people and education and living a life worth living. And I'm thankful that we're able to have a few moments to talk about the holidays and spend time. So to Johnson, to Stacy, to Benjamin, to Nicholas, to everybody out there that is participating, I love all you guys. I hope you thoroughly have an amazing holiday. And that's what we got for today. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for everything. That's what we got for today. Aloha.